A while back, I made a video comparing the current offering made by the original Indiana Jones hatter, Herbert Johnson, against respected hat maker Advintage's efforts on the elusive Raiders of the Lost Ark Fedora. The response was as expected. There have always been two major camps where the Raiders hat debate unfolds. One side adheres to the official information that the crown is the same height as the hats in the other films, while the other side believes that due to a myriad of speculative circumstances, the Raiders fedora is markedly taller than the subsequent lids worn by Harrison Ford. As a result, a number of people in the comments said they liked the Herbert Johnson better than the Advintage, even though the Herbert Johnson's shaping was far and away off the mark. Determined not to entirely give up on the Herbert Johnson since I'd waited so long after paying a hefty sum for it, I turned to Penman Hats in Oregon. Penman Hats has been a mainstay for me for many years. John Penman makes every kind of hat and has decades of experience. I acquired my Dick Tracy fedora and my Doctor Who hats from Penman. And if that's not enough of a show of confidence, Steve Delk, the hatter on Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, who started making hats as a fan in 2004 before Spielberg and crew came knocking at his door, personally selected John Penman to take over his own brand, Adventurebilt, when he retired. All of Delk's perfected Raiders of the Lost Ark hat blocks, as well as all of the blocks he used to make Ford's hats in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, as well as all of Delk's specialized knowledge, are now with John Penman. Penman was already great at making Indiana Jones hats prior to Delk's retirement. His Last Crusade hat, for example, is apparently the stuff of legend. However, after the merging of Penman and Adventurebilt, there was no question John was the first hatter I'd think of with any questions on Indiana Jones fedoras. John has maintained the Raiders hat Steve Delk made for me back in 2005. John gave it a full reblock in 2018, and recently reshaped it to reflect Crystal Skull at my request in honor of Steve Delk. John doesn't make costume hats. John makes hats for true hat enthusiasts, people like myself who wear them in daily life and have for decades. So I decided to see if John could improve the situation with this Herbert Johnson. What came back was a staggering result. It looked like an entirely different hat in all the best ways possible. However, it still lacked something intangible. On a shelf it looked amazing, but as soon as it was worn, the brim just fell asleep. At this point, if you're wondering why I was discussing Advintage a few months ago instead of a Penman hat, the simple truth is my Penman hats were not Indiana Jones styles, and my Adventurebilt originally made by Steve Delk had been changed to Crystal Skull mere months before the Herbert Johnson arrived, so there was no ability to give viewers a direct comparison. Now it seemed Kismet had intervened. The Herbert Johnson had refused the call to greatness. But John knew me well enough to see I wasn't going to let this go. So he put forward a few hunches. One, he identified the fact that after 20 years with a hat with Steve Delk's work and materials, the quality of the Herbert Johnson overall was never going to sit right with me. Two, he suspected that my literal head wasn't the average oval, but round, and I confirmed with my mother that I was born backward, and the maternity ward staff couldn't stop commenting at the time on my perfectly round head. This was the final bit of evidence John needed to put his plan into action. John set to work on a Raiders hat that would meet the requirements of both the durability of everyday wear and the unique aspect of the Raiders fedora that was still eluding me. While the Advintage is, if you'll pardon the pun, an incredible visual hat trick with its exacting silhouette, it, like many other fedora makes, doesn't exhibit the pliable, dare I say floppy nature of the Raiders hat, a trait that is largely absent from the hats in all of the sequels. Now, in full disclosure, Advintage does ask how stiff you want the felt on each order, but suggests a medium amount, which I suspect has become the recommendation due to many customers wanting costume-perfect items right out of the box and not hats for daily wear that you live with and naturally break in over time, which does make me curious as to how an Advintage hat with a minimal amount of stiffener would behave. My Advintage Raiders is not starch rigid like a cowboy hat, but it will never have a brim that flutters in the air like a ship's sail the way Ford's hat does in that film. However, the immovable variable between Advintage and Penman is in the way they finish Indiana Jones hats in terms of the crown dimensions. Remember what I said a second ago about the two sides of the crown height argument? Advintage is in the camp that the Raiders' crown height is taller. Penman is on the other side of the debate, committed to the Raiders' hat having a crown height that is identical to the other films. Despite a lot of confirmed dimensional measurements about the hats used in the films, the crown height has created a land of confusion and disagreement. Penman stays firmly on the side of the known height, confirmed by Steve Delk years ago. If the height is confirmed, then why the debate? Well, the suspicion is that the block height has in some cases by some hatters been misidentified as finished height. And look, I can understand this perception because as much as I believe in Steve Delk's information, as he was the bona fide expert, there are simply a lot of moments and shots in Raiders of the Lost Ark where that hat looks tall. So depending on the lenses being used, the lighting, the camera angle, and the state of the hat at any given point in the film, optical illusions are going to play merry hob with one's eyes. Which then leads me to the more meta question. Do you want what was physically present, or what it frequently turned into in front of those lenses, regardless of whether or not that was real or an illusion? And the problem there is that every individual has a different set of preferences to meet those requirements. Having lived for 20 years with Steve Delk's Fedora, with half of that life under John Penman's care, I trust John's eye and skill, as well as his commitment to making hats for daily use, just like Delk had approached the Indiana Jones Fedora. John doesn't approach the Raiders' hats as sculpted replicas, because all bespoke hats eventually adopt the unique shape and quirks of the owner's head. In other words, John knows the hat is going to change subtly over time in different ways for every individual owner. This is not to say the hat won't look like the Raiders' hat anymore. Far from. It simply means that given the many unique characteristics of the Raiders' Fedora, especially the warped brim, the owner's head is going to determine which characteristics eventually are sharpened and which are softened. And that's different for everyone. John took the step of preparing my hat in a basic fashion with the sweatband installed, but no liner, ribbon, or shaping, before sending it to me to test fit with John live on video chat to personally verify the position the crown needed to be in for the proper brim warp effect seen in Raiders. Once that was marked with chalk, I sent the hat back to John. We'd learned my head shape was preventing the normal amount of brim warp from happening. Why this was happening with the Herbert Johnson and not the Advintage likely had to do with the fact the Herbert Johnson's amount of off-centering was very slight, while the Advintage Streets of Cairo is not only made on a special block just for that specific style, but the amount of turn for the crease is far more off-center, looking to be about an inch, and the hat is made stiffer to hold the shape. However, as we've just observed, the Raiders' hat shouldn't be stiff, which is what John intended to deliver with his top-of-the-line premium felt option, a Portuguese felt that would meet halfway between the dress felt softness of the original Raiders' hat, but have the durability of a superior felt quality like my 20-year-old bulletproof Adventurebilt from Steve Delk. The end result is both artistically and mathematically perfect, complete with an artificially shifted ribbon bow so the bow knot sits just ahead of my ear like it should, even though the offset for the brim warp is a full 2 inches off center. The fit is perfect, the profile of the hat is without a flaw, and you might notice it is a standard Raiders shape, without any scene-specific details. Not only is that the way John prefers to tackle the Raiders Fedora, as I've explained, it's also because of my lifelong experience with wearing hats. The best way I've found to achieve the Raiders look is by simply wearing your hat when you go out, travel, run errands, make it a part of your daily life. My original Adventurebilt looks amazing after 20 years of use. I can only imagine what this new one will look like in a few years, since it's truly custom made for my head shape, and John Penman made that possible. If I had any gripe, it isn't with the hat, but a trend in the demands of Indiana Jones hat buyers these days. Over the years, the habits of the Indiana Jones clothing community have shifted in a major way. When we were first cutting through this unknown jungle in the late 90s together on the internet, the majority of people wanted clothing to wear as part of their personal style. As such, we wanted the long-term durability as much as the accuracy. When Steve Delk cracked the code on the Raiders Fedora, he tested every shade of brown to find a shade that would start darker, but fade into that correct Indiana Jones color through regular outdoor use. That certainly ended up being the case with my hat. Unfortunately, over the years, Indiana Jones as a clothing lifestyle has given way to costuming and cosplay. with people more fixated on add-to-cart experiences where they get a bang-on accurate hat right out of the box and can wear it a few times a year to sci-fi and comic conventions. As such, many hatters have suffered the complaints of OCD cosplayers who want the hats to look good in flash photography photos at events. Steele and Jones acquiesced on this point to such a degree that their current hats showing up look almost khaki in color, inaccurate in the other extreme. Penman has not gone that far, but has chosen a color that is absolutely correct to the Indiana Jones films right from the starting line. And that's great. It looks identical to the color of my 20-year-old Adventurebilt with a slight tonal shift for more subtle accuracy. However, I fear I'm going to wear this hat so often that when the fading occurs, it won't be moving toward accurate like the darker sable hats do over time, but it will move away from accurate. I'm in the minority of the customer base. I admit that. Most people don't wear these daily anymore. They buy them as artifacts themselves and then wear them so infrequently that they will stay accurate for decades and decades in terms of color. But I'm different. Long-term color worries aside, this is the most comfortable hat I've ever worn, the most bespoke hat I've ever owned, and the most effortlessly accurate Raiders of the Lost Ark Fedora I've ever encountered. I have enough experience to know that I need to put some miles on it and it will look even more amazing, and will eventually rival my older Adventurebilt very likely. I'm just grateful beyond words that Penman Hats is around, and that he saved Adventurebilt from disappearing. John Penman is the best in the business, and I'm relieved he's here for people who wear bespoke hats to help them get the most amazing results possible, whatever kind of hat they've always dreamed about. For me, it's always been Raiders of the Lost Ark, and John has delivered 3 times on that promise now. Once to keep my original Adventurebilt looking its best, a second time to reinvent the disappointing work by Herbert Johnson, and the third time with a bespoke result from the ground up that feels like it jumped out of my mind's eye. There is nothing I can conceive that Penman Hats cannot make.
Where'd you get this? From him?